In the autumn of 1974, in the flat expanse of Cimarron County, the wind had a voice. It was not the gentle whisper of breezes through summer corn, but a low, abrasive moan that started in the west and did not stop for days. It was a sound that scraped the paint from barns and the hope from men. Silas Black, who was then 68 years old, knew the sound better than any man alive in that part of the Panhandle. He had been born to it, raised in its constant presence, and had learned to read its subtle shifts in pitch and temper. His farm was a square section, 640 acres of land his father had bought for a song after the first man to own it gave up and went back east. The soil was a fine, silty loam, rich when it had water, but as light as flour when it did not. For the past 3 years it had not. The rains had grown sparse, then forgetful, and now the land was a uniform shade of pale tan, cracked in the low spots and pulverized to dust on the high ones. The problem was not just the lack of rain, it was the wind. It came unimpeded across 300 miles of Texas and New Mexico, gathering speed and force until it hit the Oklahoma Panhandle with a fury that was geological in its scale. It lifted the topsoil from one field and deposited it in the ditches of another. It buried fences, scoured young wheat from the ground, and filled the air with a brown haze that turned the midday sun into a dim, orange coin. This autumn, the crisis had reached a new stage. The last of the winter wheat, planted on a prayer and a half-inch of rain in September, had failed to germinate properly. The shoots that did emerge were weak, sickly things, and the first hard blow of October had sheared them off of the ground, leaving the fields bare. Silas walked the perimeter of his northernmost quarter section, the one that caught the worst of the prevailing westerlies. He stooped, pinching the soil between his thumb and forefinger. It was not soil anymore. It was dust. It had no structure, no life. It rose in a little puff and was immediately carried away on the breeze. He had seen this before. He had been a boy during the great drought of the 1930s, a witness to the black blizzards that had given the Dust Bowl its name. He remembered the grit in the bread, the mud made from dust and water in the drinking glasses, the constant, maddening static electricity in the air. He remembered his father, a man as lean and tough as a strip of jerky, standing on this same land, looking west with an expression that was not fear, but a grim and terrible understanding. The neighbors had tried different things over the years. In the 50s, after another dry spell, many had adopted contour plowing, hoping the furrows would catch the wind-blown soil. It had worked for a time until a truly dry year came and the wind simply blew the contours flat. In the 60s, government programs had encouraged the planting of cover crops, but in a year like this one, the cover crops failed just like the cash crops, leaving the ground exposed once more. The consensus at the co-op and the feed store was that there was nothing to be done. A man had to hunker down, hope for rain, and pray he had enough credit at the bank to see him through to the next season. The land was just built that way. The wind was a fact of life, as immutable as the sunrise. A week later, a county vehicle, a new Ford sedan with a government seal on the door, pulled into Silas's lane. A young man in his late 20s, with crisp trousers and a clipboard, got out. His name was Arthur Thorne, the new extension agent for the county. He was bright, educated, and carried with him the unshakable confidence of a man who believed every problem had a solution that could be found on a spreadsheet. Thorne had come to assess the situation. He walked with Silas to the edge of the north field, the wind tugging at his tie and whipping his carefully combed hair across his forehead. He kicked at a clod of dirt, which disintegrated on contact. "It's bad, Mr. Black," Thorne said, his voice loud against the wind. "As bad as I've seen. The soil particle aggregation is non-existent. We're looking at severe aeolian erosion across this entire sector." Silas just nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where a low brown cloud was building. He had heard words like that before from other men with clipboards. They were just fancy ways of saying the dirt was blowing away. Thorne clicked his pen. "We've run the numbers back at the office. Based on the current drought projections and wind velocity models, you're set to lose up to 3 inches of topsoil from this quarter section before spring. That's decades of fertility. Gone. He looked at Silas, his expression a mixture of professional concern and pity. Frankly, the most cost-effective recommendation is to let it go. Fallow it, collect the disaster payment, and hope for a wet spring next year. Trying to fight this is just throwing good money after bad. Silas remained silent for a long moment, the wind singing its high, lonely song in his ears. He looked at the vast, empty field, then at the fence line that marked its western boundary. It was a straight line, running north to south for a perfect mile. "I'm not going to let it go," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm, barely audible over the wind. "I'm going to plant a wall." Thorn blinked. "A wall? A wall of what?" "Trees," Silas said. "A mile long, 10 rows deep. Right along that fence line." The young agent stared at him. He glanced at the parched ground, at the dust devils dancing in the distance, at the merciless blue sky. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, which he quickly tried to stifle. "Mr. Black," he said, his tone shifting to one of gentle condescension, "with all due respect, you can't be serious. Nothing will grow in this. The soil has no moisture. The seedlings would be desiccated or sandblasted to death within a week. The cost of the saplings alone would be astronomical. And for what? A project that has a 0% chance of success, according to every metric we have." Silas's gaze did not waver from the fence line. "The metrics are wrong." Thorn sighed, a man trying to reason with a stubborn child. "Look, I understand the attachment to your land. My grandfather was a farmer. But we have to be realistic. The data is clear. It's a noble idea, an old-fashioned idea, but it's not a practical solution for the conditions we're facing in 1974. It's a fantasy." Silas turned to look at the young man for the first time. His eyes were the color of a faded sky, and they held a depth that Thorn found unsettling. "It's not a fantasy," Silas said. "It's a memory." The story of Silas's folly, as it came to be known, spread quickly. It was a topic of conversation at the diner in Boise City, over coffee and lukewarm pie. It was discussed in the dusty aisles of the feed store, between men loading sacks of cattle cake and mineral blocks. The consensus was uniform. The old man had finally cracked. The drought and the loneliness of the farm had gotten to him. "Heard Silas Black is going to plant trees," one farmer would say, shaking his head. "Heard that too," another would reply. "A whole mile of M. In this dust. Might as well plant dollar bills and hope for a money tree." They did not say it with malice. It was with a kind of weary pity. Silas had always been a bit different. He was debt-free, a rarity in modern farming. He still used a 1952 Ford 8-inch tractor for his light work, maintaining it with a devotion most men reserve for their wives. He didn't chase the biggest yields or the latest hybrid seeds. He farmed quietly, methodically, paying more attention to the land itself than to the market reports. They saw him as a relic, a man out of time. His plan to plant trees was just the final, definitive proof that he was no longer operating in the real world. Thorn's official recommendation, to fallow the land, was seen as the only sensible path. Silas's refusal was seen as pure, simple foolishness. Silas heard the talk. He heard it in the way the clerk at the hardware store asked him if he was feeling all right. He saw it in the glances of his neighbors when their trucks passed on the county road. He did not mind. Their opinions were based on what they could see. His plan was based on what he remembered. That night, after a supper of beans and cornbread, Silas sat at his worn kitchen table. He opened a drawer and took out a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. The ink on the first page was faded, written in a strong, clear hand that was not his own. Jedediah Black, it read. His book, 1935-inch. He turned the pages slowly. It was his father's journal. It was not a diary of feelings, but a logbook of survival. It contained records of rainfall measured in fractions of an inch, notes on which varieties of sorghum stood up best to the wind, and drawings of modified cultivators designed to till the soil without pulverizing it. Then he found the entry he was looking for. It was dated May 1936, the heart of the worst of it. The wind had blown for 40 straight days. The sky had been dark with dust. The government men had come then, too, with their own plans and their own certainties. They had told his father to abandon the farm, to head for California. His father had written, "The wind is not the enemy. The bare ground is the enemy. The wind is just the executioner. It cannot kill what it cannot lift. It cannot lift what is held down." Silas remembered the day his father spoke those words aloud. They had been huddled in the lee of the barn, the air so thick with dirt it was hard to breathe. Silas had been 10 years old. His father had pointed to a scraggly line of wild plum bushes and scraggier mulberry trees growing along a dry creek bed. On the windward side of the thicket, a drift of fine soil had accumulated deep and soft. On the leeward side, for a distance of 50 yards, the ground was calmer. The dust devils did not form there. The air was clearer. "You see that, son?" his father had said, his voice raspy with dust. "The water doesn't disappear. It goes down. The soil doesn't disappear. It just moves. The job of a farmer isn't to make the rain fall. It's to hold the water and the soil that he's given. That little wall of brush is doing a better job of farming right now than I am." Jedediah Black had not had the time or the resources to act on his observation. The rains had returned, eventually, and the urgency was lost in a new work of rebuilding and replanting. He had died in 1958, leaving Silas the farm and the notebook. For years, the notebook had sat in the drawer, a relic of a bygone era. But the principles it contained were not bygone. They were timeless. The core principle was simple. A barrier, even a porous one, did not stop the wind. It disrupted it. It lifted the wind up, and more importantly, it slowed the air at ground level. The wind's power to lift soil particles increased exponentially with its velocity. If you could cut the ground level velocity by half, you cut its erosive power by a factor of 8 or more. A wall of trees would not stop the wind, but it would gentle it. It would force the wind to drop its stolen payload of soil on the windward side and would create a wide, calm shadow on the leeward side where the ground could rest and hold. Silas closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. He did not need a spreadsheet or a government model. He had his father's words and the evidence of his own eyes. The men at the feed store could laugh. The young agent could shake his head in pity. They saw a fool planting sticks in the dust. He saw a man keeping a promise to his father, a promise to hold the soil he had been given. The next morning, Silas began his work. He did not go to a commercial nursery. He knew that the saplings sold there were bred for ideal conditions, coddled with fertilizer and regular water. They would not survive here. He needed trees that were already adapted to hardship. He needed natives. He hitched a small, rickety trailer to his old pickup truck, a 1961 Ford F-100, and drove 20 miles south to the Cimarron River. The riverbed was mostly dry, a wide ribbon of sand, but along its banks, in the places where the water still ran underground, thickets of trees and shrubs grew in a dense, tangled chaos. He spent a week there. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that belied his age. He was searching for specific species, the ones his father had noted in the journal. First, Osage orange, which the old-timers called bois d'arc. It was a thorny, unlovely tree, but its wood was dense and rot-resistant, and its roots were tenacious. It feared neither drought nor wind. He found a dense stand of young trees, and, using a sharp spade and a pruning saw, carefully dug up 200 saplings, taking care to get as much of the root ball as possible. He wrapped the roots in damp burlap sacks he had brought for the purpose. Next, he looked for mulberry. The wild mulberry was not a majestic tree, but it was fast-growing and its roots spread wide, creating a dense mat just below the surface. It was a binder. He harvested another 200 of those. Then came the green ash, a tree that could grow tall and flexible, a tree that would bend but not break in the high winds. Finally, for the outer rows, he gathered tough, shrubby species, desert willow and sand plum, plants that were barely more than bushes but were masters of survival in arid lands. By the end of the week, the bed of his pickup and the small trailer were filled with over 1,000 young trees, their roots carefully wrapped and kept moist. He drove home slowly, the old truck groaning under the load. When he pulled into his yard, The setting sun cast a long shadow from the pile of saplings. It looked like a pile of dead sticks. To anyone else, it was a testament to his folly. To Silas, it was an arsenal. The real work began with the tractor. His Ford 8N was not a powerful machine by modern standards. Its 23-horsepower engine was dwarfed by the 150-horsepower behemoths his neighbors drove. But Silas knew its every quirk and ailment. He had rebuilt the carburetor himself, knew the exact feel of the clutch, the precise point where the hydraulic lift would catch. It was an extension of his own will. He mounted a post-hole digger to the three-point hitch on the back of the tractor. It was a simple, screw-like auger powered by the tractor's PTO shaft. He spent a morning sharpening the auger's cutting edges with a file, cleaning and greasing the gearbox. He would need it to drill thousands of holes. It had to be ready. He started at the southwest corner of the north field, right against the old barbed wire fence. He had walked the line the day before, driving wooden stakes every 40 feet to keep his line straight. A mile was 5,280 feet. He planned to plant a tree every 6 feet. That was 880 trees per row. He planned for 10 rows. That was 8,800 trees. He had harvested over 1,000, but that was just the beginning. This was a multi-year project. He would start with 3 rows this winter. He climbed onto the iron seat of the 8N, turned the key, and pulled the starter. The engine coughed to life with a familiar, sputtering roar. He set the throttle, engaged the PTO, and lowered the auger to the ground. The earth was as hard as concrete. The auger bit whined in protest and kicked up a cloud of pale dust. Silas did not force it. He let the weight of the implement do the work, letting the screw chew its way slowly into the dry soil. After a minute of grinding, he had a hole 2 feet deep and 9 inches wide. He disengaged the PTO, moved the tractor forward 6 feet, and began again. Hole after hole. The work was monotonous, a slow rhythm of metal against earth. The sun climbed higher. The wind picked up, blowing the dust from the auger into his face, coating his clothes and skin with a fine, gritty film. He wore no mask, only a battered felt hat pulled low. He was reaccustoming himself to the taste of his own land. His neighbors drove by on the county road. They slowed their pickups, stared for a moment at the old man on his little tractor drilling holes in a field of dust, and then shook their heads and drove on. They saw what they expected to see, a fool engaged in a pointless, back-breaking task. They did not see what Silas saw. They did not see the network of fine, hair-like roots that would spread from each of these holes. They did not see the web of life that would begin to stitch the soil together. They did not understand that he was not just digging holes. He was planting an anchor. He drilled for a week. Every day from sunup to sundown, the little tractor moved slowly along the fence line, leaving a trail of perfect, uniform holes in its wake. By the end of the week, he had drilled over 2,600 holes, a straight, triple line of them running the full mile of the fence line. The sheer, relentless labor of it was staggering. His shoulders ached, and his hands were raw, but a deep sense of purpose settled over him. Now came the planting. He could not just drop the saplings in the dry holes. That would be a death sentence. He needed water. His well was deep and reliable, one of the few in the area that had not gone dry, another legacy of his father's foresight. He had a 500-gallon water tank on a trailer. He filled it and hitched it to his pickup. He drove the truck along the line of holes, and at each one, he stopped. He climbed out, uncoiled a length of hose, and let 10 gallons of water gush into the empty hole. The dry earth drank it greedily, turning dark and muddy at the bottom. He did this for every single hole, a slow, painstaking process of driving, stopping, watering, and driving again. It took him 2 full days to pre-water the holes for the first row. Then, and only then, did he begin to plant. He took a sapling from its burlap wrapping. It was an Osage orange, about 4 feet tall, little more than a thorny stick with a dense clump of roots at its base. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and gently placed the root ball into the muddy bottom of the hole. He held the trunk straight with one hand while he used the other to backfill the hole, pushing the loose, dusty soil in around the roots. He did not pack it tight. He left it loose so the water could find its way down and the roots could find their way out. He firmed the soil at the top with his hands, creating a small, dish-like depression around the base of the sapling. This basin would catch and hold any rain that might fall, directing it right to the roots. Finally, he took a bucket and gave the newly planted tree another 5 gallons of water, a final drink to settle it into its new home. One tree. Then he stood up, joints cracking, and moved to the next hole. He repeated the process. Neil placed backfill firm water. Over and over. The sun beat down. The wind blew. The world saw a man burying sticks in the dirt. Silas knew he was performing a kind of surgery, carefully implanting a living system into the wounded flesh of the earth. He worked this way through November and into the cold heart of December. He planted the first row with Osage orange, the toughest of the tough, for the windward side. The second row was green ash. The third was mulberry. He had to make more trips to the river bottom for more saplings, each trip a long, arduous day of digging and driving. The men at the feed store stopped talking about it. It was old news. The crazy old man was still at it. That was all. Section Arthur Thorne, the extension agent, drove by once in late November. He saw Silas, a small, stooped figure moving slowly along the immense, empty landscape. He saw the rows of freshly planted twigs, looking fragile and pathetic against the vastness of the field. He did not stop. He felt a pang of genuine pity. He went back to his office and wrote a final note in Silas's file. Landowner pursuing non-viable, traditionalist planting strategy against official recommendation. Project failure is a certainty. No further follow-up required. Winter settled in. The wind grew colder, carrying with it the bite of the distant Rockies. The ground froze solid. Silas's work was forced to a halt. The 3 rows of saplings, nearly 2,700 of them, stood naked and motionless in the frozen fields. They looked dead, but Silas knew they were not. Below the frost line, their roots were beginning to explore their new home, drawing on the deep moisture he had given them, preparing for the spring. He had done all he could for now. The rest was up to the trees and the time. During the winter months, Silas did not rest. He prepared for the next phase. He spent his days in the old barn, a place that smelled of hay, oil, and time. He overhauled the engine of the 8-inch tractor, replacing the piston rings and honing the cylinders. He methodically cleaned and sharpened every tool he owned. He was a man preparing for a long campaign. He also spent the cold evenings studying his father's notebook. He read the entries about the trees his father had observed, not just the species, but their placement. The wall must be permeable, one entry read. A solid wall creates turbulence. The wind will pour over the top and scour the ground on the other side. It must be like a comb, not a dam. It must slow the wind, not fight it. This was why he had chosen different types of trees. The dense, shrubby Osage orange would form a low, thick barrier. The faster-growing mulberry would fill in the middle layer. The tall, flexible ash trees would form the upper layer, combing the high-velocity winds. The 10-row design was not random. It was a carefully engineered system designed to create a deep zone of graduated calm. Spring arrived, not with gentle rains, but with more wind. The fields of his neighbors, left fallow as Thorne had advised, began to move again. The air was once more filled with a brown pall. But along Silas's western fence line, something was happening. He walked the line every morning. At first, there was nothing. The twigs stood bare and seemingly lifeless. Then, in late March, he saw it. On the thorny branches of the Osage orange, tiny green buds were beginning to swell. A week later, the mulberries showed the same signs of life. By mid-April, the ash trees, the last awake, began to unfurl their first small, tender leaves. They had survived the winter. The deep watering, the careful planting, the inherent toughness of the native species, it had been enough. A faint blush of green, fragile but undeniable, now marked the mile-long line. The survival of the saplings was only the first, small victory. The real test was the summer. The heat came in May, fierce and unrelenting. The sun baked the ground into a pale crust. The memory of the autumn rains was long gone. Any moisture near the surface evaporated in hours. This was the phase of the work that tested Silas's endurance more than any other. The young trees needed water. He began a new routine, as relentless and monotonous as the digging had been. Every third day, he would fill the 500-gallon tank at his well. He would drive the pickup slowly along the rows, and at each of the 2,700 trees, he would stop, get out, and give it a drink from the hose. A full tank was enough for about 50 trees. It took him 10 trips to the well, 10 slow drives along the mile-long line to water them all. It was a full day's work from dawn until dusk just to give one round of water. And 3 days later, he would have to do it all again. June, July, August. The sun was a hammer. The temperature hovered above 100 degrees for weeks on end. The wind never stopped. It was a hot, desiccating breath that stole moisture from every living thing. The neighbors' fields were wastelands. The talk at the diner was of selling off cattle herds, of bank foreclosures. Through it all, Silas continued his pilgrimage of water. He grew leaner. His skin turned the color of old leather. His hands were permanently stained with dirt and grease. He moved more slowly in the evenings, his body aching with a fatigue that was bone deep. But he did not stop. He was tending his wall, and the wall was responding. The trees grew. It was not a dramatic, visible explosion of growth. It was a slow, stubborn assertion of life against the odds. The Osage orange, which had been 4-foot sticks, were now 5 feet tall and branching out, their thorns hardening. The mulberries, always the fastest, had put on 2 feet of growth and were forming a dense, leafy screen. The ash trees had shot up, some of them now taller than Silas himself. More importantly, they were beginning to do their work. Silas could feel it. As he worked among the trees, the air was different. The constant, grating whine of the wind was softer here. The force of the gusts was broken, diffused. He could take his hat off, and it would not be immediately snatched from his head. The ground between the rows was shaded, cooler. Weeds, the first sign of life returning to the soil, were beginning to sprout in the narrow strips of calm. In the fall of 1975, 1 year after he had begun, Silas started on the next 3 rows. He went back to the river bottom for more saplings. He fired up the old 8N and its auger. He drilled another 2,600 holes. He spent the winter planting. He spent the next summer watering. The process was the same, but the conditions were different. He was now working in the partial shelter of the first 3 rows. The wind was less severe. The ground held the water a little longer. The work was still brutally hard, but it was no longer a battle against a completely hostile environment. He was now working within the small zone of stability he had created. The community watched, no longer with ridicule, but with a kind of baffled silence. The wall of trees was no longer a collection of pathetic twigs. It was now a substantial feature of the landscape, a mile-long, 6-row-deep slash of green against the monotonous brown. It was still seen as a curiosity, a massive amount of effort for a questionable outcome, but it was impossible to ignore. Arthur Thorne made his annual rounds that fall. He had been promoted and now oversaw a larger territory. He had not thought about Silas Black or his non-viable project in months. When he drove down the county road bordering Silas's farm, he had to slow his car, then stop altogether. He stared at the wall of trees. It was now in places 10 feet tall. It was dense, green, and alive. He got out of his car, the wind immediately trying to tear the door from his hand. He walked to the fence line. The wind howled past his ears. Then he stepped through the wire fence and into the outer row of trees. The change was instantaneous and profound. It was like stepping from a noisy factory into a quiet library. The roar of the wind dropped to a murmur. The pressure on his face vanished. The air was still and cool. He looked up. The branches of the young trees were swaying and rustling, absorbing the wind's energy. He looked down. The ground was dark and soft, covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves that were not blowing away. They were staying put, forming the first layer of new humus. He walked deeper into the shelter belt, crossing through the rows of osage, orange, mulberry, and ash. With each row, the air became calmer. By the time he reached the sixth row, the silence was almost absolute. He could hear the buzz of an insect, a sound he had not heard out in the open fields for years. He looked east, across the quarter section that the trees were meant to protect. Out there, the wind was still blowing, but its character had changed. It was no longer a uniform, ground-hugging sheet of force. It was rolling, turbulent, its energy dissipated. The little dust devils that constantly danced across the neighboring farms were absent here. The surface of the soil was stable. Thorne stood there for a long time, the clipboard hanging uselessly at his side. The data had said this was impossible. The models had predicted a 0% chance of success. The spreadsheets, the metrics, the entire edifice of his modern, scientific approach had been proven definitively wrong by an old man with a 1950s tractor and a memory. It was not just that the trees had grown, it was that the system was working. He could feel it. The quiet, undeniable fact of it surrounded him. He felt a sense of professional vertigo, the ground shifting beneath the foundations of his education. He turned and walked back to his car, a deeply thoughtful and humbled man. For 2 more years, Silas continued his work. He planted the final 4 rows, extending the shelter belt to its full 10-row depth. These rows included desert willow and sand plum, lower-growing shrubs that would seal the bottom of the wall, preventing the wind from sneaking underneath. He continued the watering, the maintenance, the constant patient tending. By the autumn of 1978, for years after he had drilled the first hole, the project was complete. The wall was a formidable presence. The first rows were now over 15 feet high. It was a dense, complex, multi-layered ecosystem, a mile long and 60 feet wide. It was a living breakwater for the wind. The effect on the 160-acre field it protected was no longer subtle. It was transformative. Silas had begun planting wheat in the sheltered zone again. The difference was stark. The seeds germinated in soil that was no longer blowing away. The young plants were not sandblasted into oblivion. The ground retained moisture longer after the rare rains. The snows of winter, instead of blowing across the bare ground and piling up in the ditches miles away, were caught by the trees. They accumulated in deep, soft drifts within the shelter belt and on the leeward field, melting slowly in the spring and delivering their moisture directly into the soil. His yields on the protected quarter section were nearly double those of his other fields. He was using less fuel because the soil was easier to work. His land was healing. The final vindication came in the spring of 1979. It was a bad year, the culmination of the long drought. The wind blew for a month without ceasing. The sky turned a sickening shade of yellow-brown. The radio issued dust storm warnings. It was a throwback to the 30s, a black blizzard in the making. On a Tuesday afternoon in April, the storm hit. A towering wall of black dust, thousands of feet high, rolled in from the west. It was a terrifying, apocalyptic sight. It blotted out the sun, plunging the landscape into an eerie twilight. The wind shrieked, a physical force that shook houses and rattled windows. Silas stood on his porch and watched it come. He was not afraid. He was curious. He had built his ark. Now came the flood. The wall of dust hit the tree line. And the most remarkable thing happened. The bottom of the dust cloud, the ground-hugging, soil-stripping part of the storm, was snagged, slowed, and lifted by the trees. The wind, forced upward by the wedge of the shelter belt, could no longer carry its heaviest load. It began to drop the stolen soil from other farms. A fine, dark silt rained down within the rows of trees, a gift of fertility from his neighbor's ruined fields. On the leeward side of the trees, in the protected field, the air was hazy, but it was not a churning vortex of dust. The wind that made it through the porous wall was gentler, a strong breeze rather than a destructive gale. Silas's wheat, now a foot high, bent and swayed, but did not break. The ground stayed put. The storm blew for 2 days. It was a catastrophe for the county. Fences were buried. Roads were impassable. The topsoil from thousands of acres was stripped away and sent eastward. Farmers who had followed the official advice, who had left their fields fallow, suffered the most. Their land was scoured down to the hardpan, a sterile, unproductive clay. They were ruined. The day after the storm passed, the sky was clear and the air was calm. The world was covered in a thick blanket of brown dust. Cars, houses, barns, everything was coated, except for one place. Silas's farm. While the rest of the county was digging out, his land was an oasis of relative order. The field behind a shelter belt was green and intact. The dust that had fallen was a fine layer, like a beneficial mulch. He had not just survived the storm, he had profited from it. The wall of trees had not only protected his land, it had harvested new soil from the wind itself. The success was absolute and undeniable. It was written on the land itself, a stark contrast between the green of Silas's field and the barren brown of his neighbors. The quantification did not require a calculator. It was measured in the living wheat on one side of a fence and the sterile hardpan on the other. It was measured in the tons of soil saved, the value of a crop preserved, the future of a farm secured. A week after the great dust storm, Arthur Thorne's Ford sedan once again pulled into Silas's lane. The car was clean, but Thorne himself looked weary. He had spent the week documenting the devastation, filling out disaster claims, talking to desperate and broken farmers. He found Silas by the barn, greasing the wheel bearings on a cultivator. He stood for a moment, watching the old man work. There was no "I told you so" in Silas's posture, no hint of triumph. He was simply doing the next task that needed to be done. Thorne cleared his throat. "Mr. Black." Silas looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded. "Mr. Thorne." The young man walked closer. He had his clipboard, but he wasn't holding it like a shield anymore. It hung limply from his hand, a useless accessory. "I've just come from the Peterson farm," Thorne said, his voice quiet. "Your neighbor to the west. He lost everything. His topsoil is in the next county. His farm, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist anymore." Silas nodded slowly. "I saw. It's a hard thing." Thorne looked from Silas to the massive wall of trees, now lush and green with spring growth, a vibrant symbol of life against the backdrop of devastation. "I came here to say something," Thorne said, meeting the old man's gaze directly. "I was wrong. Everything I learned, everything I was taught, everything my models predicted, it was all wrong, and you were right." The admission hung in the quiet air between them. It was a simple statement, unadorned and direct. For a man like Thorne, a man built on a foundation of expertise and data, it was the hardest sentence he had ever had to say. Silas did not smile or gloat. He simply gave a slight, acknowledging nod. He picked up a wrench. "Some things you can't see from an office. I want to understand," Thorne said, his voice earnest. "Not just that it worked. I can see that it worked. I want to understand why. Why did you know, when everyone else, myself included, saw a fool wasting his time?" Silas put the wrench down. He looked at the young man, and for the first time, he saw not an arrogant official, but a student who was ready to learn. "Come with me," he said. He did not lead Thorne to the house to show him a notebook. The knowledge was not in the book anymore. It was in the land. He led him to the shelter belt. They walked along the outer row, the wind a constant pressure on their left sides. "You felt the storm," Silas said. "It was like a river, wasn't it? A river of wind and dirt." "Yes," Thorne agreed. "A flood. Your plan was to let the flood run its course." "My plan was to build a dam," Silas said. "But not a solid dam. My father taught me. A solid dam would break, or the river would just pour over it and be even angrier on the other side." They stepped into the first row of Osage orange. The wind noise dropped. "This is the first part of it," Silas explained, touching a thorny branch. "This is the jetty. It's low and rough. It doesn't stop the river. It just trips it up. It makes the water closest to the bank slow down. When water slows, the heavy stuff it's carrying falls out. Sand, gravel. In this case, the heaviest particles of soil." He pointed to the ground, where a fine layer of new soil was visible among the leaf litter. They walked deeper into the rows of mulberry and ash. The air grew progressively calmer. "These middle rows," Silas continued, "they're like weeds in the river. They don't stop the current, they just fill up the channel with drag. They absorb the energy. They make the flow confused, turbulent, and slow. Finally, they reach the innermost row, and beyond it, the edge of the wheat field. Here, the air was moving in a gentle, almost lazy eddy. "By the time the river gets here," Silas said, gesturing to the calm field, "it's not a river anymore. It's just a creek. It has no power left to do any harm. All its anger is spent back there in the trees." He stooped down and picked up a handful of soil from the edge of his wheat field. It was dark, rich, and held its shape in his palm. It was full of moisture and life. "The wind is not the enemy," Silas said, repeating the words from his father's journal. "The bare ground is the enemy. The trees don't stop the wind. They just hold the ground. That's all it is." Thorn looked at the soil in the old man's hand, then at the vast, green, living machine of the shelter belt. He finally understood. It was not about fighting nature. It was about understanding its principles and using them to your advantage. It was a solution of immense sophistication, disguised as simple, old-fashioned labor. "This," Thorn said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "This should be in a textbook. This should be the official recommendation." "It was," Silas said quietly, "in my father's book." Thorn went back to his office that day a changed man. He pulled his original report on Silas Black's farm, with its dismissive and confident predictions of failure. He tore it up. Then he began to write a new one. He wrote about the principles of permeable windbreaks. He used Silas's analogy of the river and the dam. He documented the specific species used, the spacing, the 10-row structure. He detailed the effects on soil retention, moisture conservation, and crop yields. He did not couch it in the dry, academic language of his training. He wrote it plainly, directly, as a practical guide. He titled the report the Cimarron County Shelter Belt Project, a case study in applied agroecology. He sent it not just to his superiors at the state level, but to every extension office in the wind-blown plains of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. He began giving talks, not about spreadsheets and models, but about an old man, his father's notebook, and a mile of trees. The knowledge, once confined to a dusty journal and an old man's memory, was adopted. The government, which had once dismissed the idea as a fantasy, now began to subsidize it. Silas's wall became the template. All across the high plains, farmers began planting shelter belts. It was not a fast or easy solution. It took years of hard work, patience, and faith, but it was a real solution. It was a systemic change, born from one man's quiet defiance. Years passed. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s. The trees on Silas's farm grew, their roots sinking deeper, their branches reaching higher. The wall, once a fragile line of saplings, was now a mature forest, 100 feet deep and 40 feet high. It was a permanent feature of the geography, visible from miles away, a dark green line of life drawn across the tan canvas of the prairie. It had its own climate, its own ecosystem. Deer sheltered in it during the winter. Birds nested in its branches. The soil within it was black and rich, a thick layer of humus built from decades of fallen leaves. The farm itself was transformed. The quarter section behind the trees was now the most productive land in the county, consistently producing healthy crops even in dry years. The rest of Silas's land benefited as well, as the calming effect of the massive windbreak extended for more than half a mile to its lee. The farm had become a stable, resilient island in a sea of volatility. It was no longer remarkable. It was simply the way things were. The new normal. Silas was older now, moving into his 80s. His steps were slower, his hands knotted with arthritis, but his eyes were still clear. He no longer did the heavy work himself. His grandson, Ben, had come to live with him after college. Ben was quiet and observant, like Silas. He had his grandfather's patience and his great-grandfather's respect for the land. One cool autumn afternoon, decades after the first sapling was planted, Silas and Ben walked the length of the shelter belt. The old Ford 8-inch tractor sat parked by the barn, no longer a primary tool, but a monument. It was clean, rust-free, and could still be started on the first try. It was a symbol of the kind of durable, reparable knowledge that had built this place. Silas stopped and pointed to a section of the Osage orange row. See that one there? The one with the split trunk? A buck did that, rubbing his antlers back in the second year. I almost pulled it out. Decided to leave it. It's ugly, but it's strong. Ben nodded, taking it in. He was not just looking at a tree. He was learning to read the history written in its bark. They reached the far end of the mile-long wall. Silas leaned against a fence post, breathing a little heavily from the walk. He looked back at the immense green rampart they had just walked beside. Your great-grandfather, he knew, Silas said, his voice a soft rasp. He knew that you don't own the land. You just borrow it. Your job is to hand it back in better shape than you found it. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, tattered object. It was the leather-bound notebook. The cover was now held together with black electrical tape. He handed it to Ben. I don't need this anymore, Silas said. The book is out there now. He gestured with his chin toward the trees. But the words are still good to remember. Ben took the notebook with a reverence that was unspoken but deeply felt. He opened it, his young fingers tracing the faded ink of his great-grandfather's handwriting. He was not just receiving a book. He was accepting a legacy, a chain of knowledge passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. He understood that the real lesson was not about planting trees. It was about listening to the land, about patience, and about having the courage to trust a deeper wisdom than the one that was fashionable at the time. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, casting a golden light on the tops of the trees. The wind picked up, the familiar evening wind from the west. It struck the wall of trees and made a sound. It was not the mournful, abrasive moan of a landscape in pain. It was a new sound, a soft, deep whisper, like the sound of a great river flowing peacefully in its channel. It was the sound of a promise kept. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait, patiently, for people to remember why they were built. They wait for the world to grow quiet enough to hear the wisdom they have been speaking all along.